Does this small rebel force in Syria stand any chance against powerful Syrian armed forces freed?
It doesn't seem that they have much of a chance because the regime has decided to be utterly brutal. This is a regime that decided, it looked at Gaddafi, it looked at Mubarak and said, the lesson is don't waver, don't show any weakness, and just grind them down. Now, the one problem they faced on is the regime is not an oil-rich regime. It's not like Saudi Arabia. It can't bribe its people. It doesn't have that kind of ability even to bribe the army. Eventually, they're going to face real cash shortfalls. And what that means going forward is the really interesting question. This is not a regime that can outlive these sanctions and all this pressure unendingly. They've got one source of cash right now, Iran, and that too is drying up.
We are hearing, Fareed, calls here and there to arm the Syrian rebels. I want you to put yourself, if you will, in the shoes of the President of the United States. What would you do?
I think it would be a very risky move, and I wouldn't do it. I'll tell you why. Firstly, this is geographically a difficult place. It's landlocked. You don't have the kind of access you had in Libya. In Libya, you had the country sort of got divided into two parts. There was an eastern part with Benghazi, easily supplyable from the sea. You had rebels who set up a capital there. They created a transitional government, and you could funnel arms and money to them through Egypt and through the Mediterranean. None of that is available in Syria. In addition, the Chinese and Russians are dead set against us, so it couldn't happen through the UN. It would be effectively a kind of unilateral or NATO operation with no international legitimacy. And finally, the odds of success are frankly not that high. This is still a regime very much in control, no real defections from the army, no defections from the intelligence service. There's no point in doing something noble and failing. And I would be very, very reluctant to advocate an American intervention.
How will the outcome in Syria affect its neighbors, Iraq, and what about Syria's ally, Iran?
Well, if you assume what's going to happen is a slow-motion either civil war or collapse of the regime over the next year or two, the biggest loser here is Iran. Iran is all in Syria. It has made a huge number of bets on the regime. It is supporting the regime. And as it unravels, it faces the prospect of the loss of an ally, the loss of a buffer. The Russians don't look too good. But frankly, nobody looks very good because you're going to have low-grade chaos and instability in the region. Everyone's going to get worried. The great danger is that Syria becomes a battleground for the forces of Iran, Iranian proxies, with the Syrian regime, and the forces of Saudi Arabia, which will tend to be Sunni, somewhat religiously motivated militias that will go in the name of God, in the name of jihad, to overturn the Assad regime. A sort of a play of what happened in Iraq might take place in Syria. And remember, in Iraq, it took a decade before it stabilized, and there were 140,000 American troops helping stabilize it. This could get very messy for very long.
And Fareed, as you know, the Russians are being accused of giving aid and comfort to President Bashar al-Assad and to giving a green light for this slaughter that's occurring in homes. What's the Russians' motivation here?
The Russians have always been very reluctant to have the UN be used as an instrument to get rid of regimes. They have an alliance with the Syrians. It's really their last Cold War alliance. You know, if you think about it, the Soviet Union used to support half these Middle Eastern countries. We used to support the other half. Soviet Union collapsed. They're left with Syria. Syria is the one Russian ally, and so I think some of it is that. But finally, remember, if the UN is allowed to intervene every time you see mass protests on the street claiming that a regime is undemocratic, they've got protests going on in Moscow right now. They've got protests taking place all over Russia. And the last thing the Russians want to do is establish some kind of international principle that when you have protests against an undemocratic regime, the UN Security Council can vote to intervene in some way or the other.